I am going to be talking today about my master's thesis, which I completed at the University of Southampton in the UK. The title of it is Lithics Out of Context, and the focus is on data analysis for secondary context marine lithics. So, the problem with lithics in secondary context today is, first of all, that they lack context. When we talk in archaeology about excavations and about data and artifacts and finding things, often we're taught that the context is the main thing that matters, that the sediment layer you find the artifact in and the place in relation to the rest of the site all create the meaning in the artifact, rather than the artifact itself. Um, and so that was a problem that I really wanted to address when these lithics that are washing up on shorelines from sites that have been submerged due to the global water rise. Um, they're often disregarded. They are set aside in museums. They're left in private collections. Um, or they're used as touchstones for the public to use. All of which are great, but there is information that can be found in these lithics. And so I set out to really investigate that. Um, Another problem is that when you're talking about sites this early in humanity's history, specifically in England, because that's where I was researching, um, there's often no other evidence. People in the past used stone tools, they used hides, they hunted animals, and all of the organics, including oftentimes evidence of their houses, and the settlings are gone. And they've just eroded in the water. But the lithics are still there. Stone doesn't degrade the same way everything else does. And finally, the last problem is that there is an unknown site of origin. There are likely thousands of sites in the oceans across the world where humans lived in the past, but with rising ocean levels and with the global cycles of glacial freeze and melt, it makes these sites submerged and then reappear multiple times, likely in the history of them. And so often the sites of origins are unknown, or they even may not exist anymore because of all the factors that could have destroyed them over the years. And so I wanted to look at all of that and really address what we can do with the evidence we have with the stone tools that are washing up and see what we can find with that. So like I said, the aim of this research is addressing those problems. It's looking at the patination change of lithics. As you can see on the first picture, there's clearly yellowing of the lithic, which comes from close proximity to iron that is oxidized when underwater, and changes the surface color of the stone. I'm looking at abrasion. There are many types of abrasion, and I used multiple scales during the study to try and create cohesion, and replicability. And as you can see again on the first picture, that red circle is showcasing a site of abrasion on the surface of the lithic where it hasn't been patinated by the yellow, which indicates that that is likely a newer or more recent period of abrasion that occurred after the patinating of the surface of the lithic. And so we may be able, so part of this research was to try and understand if we were able to look at the patination and the surface abrasion and understand if there are multiple periods of movement in the life cycle of the lithic as we are trying to track its path from the site of deposition to washing up or collection on the shores. I wanted to look at contributing marine factors. This includes marine growth on the surface of the lithic, as you can see on my second example. Um, there are small circles from worms encrusting the surface, as well as marks from bryozoan on the inner flint of the stone. I looked at gloss patination, so how shiny and how silicated the surface of the lithic is, and then I looked at the depth of abrasion. So This would be whether the abrasion reached beyond the cortex, beyond the patina, how intensive the movement underwater was, or how coarse the gravels it was grinding against were, to create an abrasion that was below surface level. And I looked at all of these factors together, to try and understand if they can lead us back to this depositional site. If you combine all these factors, to see if they can show a path of movement, um, from where the lithic was found to where it was originally deposited, because that would solve yet another problem. It would help point us towards these sites of origin that we are fundamentally missing out on. Due to no one's fault, there's a lot of ocean to survey, and like I said, not a lot of evidence. So I started by looking at the Chain Operatoire framework. This is a French framework, and it's really primary in studying lithics. But when you look at it, what I'm researching comes after it. So the chain operatoire starts with the raw material procurement, the place where you excavate the rock, the place where you pick it up. And then it goes to the technology, how you carve the rock, what you're using it for, and what the goals of that are. And then you go to the discard. So the chain operatoire ends where I want to begin. Um, all of the steps in this system really matter once you know where the lithic has been found, right? You know what I'm calling the site of origin, what they're calling the site of discard. Um, and in my framework, I really wanted to replicate this, but to elongate it, because as I said, this one ends where I am trying to begin. But at the same time, I think it's really valid. And so I created a proposed framework that is fairly complex and it takes a lot of factors to understand. So I'll walk you through it. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask me because I'm always open to answering questions and to improving my frameworks. Um, so if you look at the top of the chart, it starts with the deposition, as I said, where the lithic was dropped. And then from there, it's either buried or it's inundated with the ingress of seawater. From there could be a sea recession or an exposure of the lithic, which includes erosion. And then, as far as we know, the sea could come up again and the lithic could not have moved or patinated at all, and it could just get buried again. Or from the burial, the lithic could undergo a patination cycle, and get patinated by the minerals and elements in the soil around it. Um, it's up for debate how much time that needs, and so patination could be anywhere from less than 24 hours up to a year, of the time it takes, depending on the surrounding factors. But from that step, the really important one is the erosion, because the erosion is what begins the process to finding the lithic. Um, from there, you can follow the chart to the middle of the slide, and it could get reburied and start the process again. Or it could go to the outside of the side, and go through erosion and then immediately become collected, and enter into a private or museum collection. Um, or you could go down the center and the lithic could undergo abrasion or marine colonization, or both. And this includes abrasion from sediment around it, abrasion from locational movement, which is another factor on this chart. Um, it could be abrasion from the other lithics around it. Um, there are many factors that could indicate that could result in abrasion. And at the same time, it could undergo marine colonization. This includes encrusting worms, bryozoa, sponges in some cases. And marine colonization itself can impact the locational movement because it impacts the weight and the dimensions of the lithic. As well, it can impact the abrasion because encrusting worms create hard shells along the surface of the lithic. Um, And so that may decrease the amount of abrasion on the lithic overall. So it's a really cyclical process that hopefully ends with collection in all of the cases we can look at, because if the lithics aren't collected, then we don't see them. Um, and there's a lot of factors that add to it. Um, Likely more factors than I've noted here, but this is the framework of what I specifically looked at in terms of these lithics. So there are issues that I want to address with this study. As I mentioned, the problems are large. Um, and so I want to address my limitations, so that I don't mislead what this research can actually do and what the limitations of it are. First of all, I analyzed the lithics by eye only. I wanted this to be really, really accessible, and applicable for private collectors, and for museums and for research. So I chose to not investigate microscopic research or 3D scanning or anything that would really involve intensive technology, that just isn't cost effective on a wide scale, and that would make this research less accessible for more people. Um, as I mentioned before, there are many factors of abrasion. I specifically just looked at abrasion as a wide scale. I didn't look at what caused that. Um, but the factors all impact the surface of lithics differently, and it's something to consider in the future. Um, as well, this is a step in the right direction. I have not found the final answer. Um, Finding the site of origin for these lithics is the overall goal, but this system of analysis is a step towards getting there. Um, I looked at different times, and how they have impacted the lithics. As I said, there have been multiple cycles of sea ingress and recession since the deposition of these lithics. As well, there's been a change in the way we use the ocean with international shipping, and that impacts how the lithics are found at the end of the day as well. And then finally, I wanted to address condition of care. Some of the lithics I analyzed, they were all kept in different conditions. Um, some of them had a lot more packaging than others, and in some cases there were chips on the lithics themselves just from the storage, and that may have impacted my findings. And it's something that I want to address in the care for lithics in general. I think that these, as elements of human history, deserve um, respect and deserve careful storage, just as ceramics and textiles do. Um, and so the condition of care is something that I took into my analysis, but it's something that I could not impact up until the point of the end of my dissertation. So, moving on to the sites of interest. I looked at 3 sites around the coast of the United Kingdom, all with lithics and all collected differently. So the first one was Boulder Cliff. This is on the north side of the Isle of Wight, um, located in the Solent Channel. The site includes a lot of high currents, and coarse gravel. It's also a site of investigation for the past 20 to 30 years, um, by the Maritime Archaeology Trust. So there is a large collection of lithics that are present there, that have been collected on site. So that's something to note, that they were collected on site rather than on a beach. They were still in secondary context, having eroded from the cliff. Um, and the large swath of information made the analysis really useful for me, as well as the ability to actually go to the site and help collect the lithics myself this past season, which really enabled me to understand the full dimensions of the currents and the tides and the sedimentary networks. I look next at Rainbow Bar. This site has high currents because it's located as well in the Solent Channel, on the opposite side of the Isle of Wight. But there are fine sediments surrounding this, except for on the bar itself. It's a gravel bar, where the lithics emerged from. They were as well collected from both the surface of the bar and from nearby beaches where they washed up. Um, there are high currents, there are fine sediments, like I said. The site was only studied briefly in the late 20th century. Um, but the collection was housed at my university, so I was able to gain access. And finally, I looked at Haysborough. This is a site on the North Sea. It is where some of the earliest human footprints in the UK were found. So it's a really, really well-known site in the United Kingdom and specifically for early human history. This has a really complex network of sediments, most of them coarse, with pockets of finer sediments in between. It's located in the North Sea, as I mentioned, which has really, really high winter storm rates, and then lower motion and activity rates in the summer season. And this site, compared to all the three, had the most unknown factors. All of the lithics from Haysborough were collected from the seashore, often by hobbyists, and reported to the British Museum and then entered into their collection there, um, to be categorized and kept by an archaeologist. So the analyses I did for this format, as I mentioned, I did color. Um, The color of the lithic was something that mattered to me because, as you can see from the top image, there is a darker rust-colored patination compared to the very bottom one where it's a lighter yellow patination. And in the middle two images, there was no patination at all. So I wanted to showcase patination and color differently, to showcase that these are separate factors that come from the same process. Um, I did make a chart to showcase what I classified as different coloration within this analysis. Um, I looked at abrasion, and as I mentioned before, I looked at multiple scales of abrasion. So I've already explained the old versus new abrasion to you, which depends mainly on patination, and on if an instance of abrasion, as circled in the red on the top image, there's abrasion and then there's patination on top of it, which indicates that this lithic came out of erosion, was abraded, and then potentially reburied to patinate the abraded area, and then came out of the sediment again. Um, or the green circle towards the top of the lithic, where the abrasion has not been patinated. I also looked at texture as a metric. This metric I had to design myself based on findings I was getting from the first collection I analyzed from Rainbow Bar, where there was a noted chalkiness of the surface that I believed likely came from a recent period of grinding against the gravel coarse sediments of the bar, um, and that lacked time underwater to gain the glossy patination, or the silicization of a lot of other lithics. So I created an abrasion scale based on percentages of the surface. And then finally, I used the Weimer abrasion scale. This was created in the 70s and early 80s, by John Weimer, and it categorizes the the surfaces of the lithics based on five different categories, um, based on millimeter measurements. There has been criticism for the system because of its lack of objectivity, um, because three people who've studied lithics and three people who haven't studied lithics may be able to look at this system and then look at a lithic and each would categorize it differently, no matter if you're well taught in the area or not. But I believed that along with my other two systems of abrasion and the fact that I am the constant in this equation, I personally analyzed every single lithic. Um, it kept a sense of objectivity and relative replicability in the system. I looked at marine growth, as I mentioned earlier, and then finally, as I already said, I mentioned patination. So the results of this for Haysboro, you can see that 5.7 of the lithics were only shown with old abrasion, compared to the 41.7 with only new abrasion. Um, and then the 71.2 with both instances of new and old abrasion. I think that out of the 513 lithics I analyzed from Haysboro, the 5.7% either indicates a smaller group of lithics that are either from a different site of origin or went through different marine networks to get to the surface. The significance of that number is up for debate because it's so small compared to the rest of the assemblage. However, the 40% of lithics with only new abrasion compared to the 70% with both forms do represent distinct clusters to me. And it seems to showcase that there may be either more than one site of origin for these lithics or very distinct channels of erosive abrasion from the site of origin to the shoreline. On the other chart, you can see texture for Haysboro lithics. 40% had no texture. Well, oh, I'm looking at cumulative percent. The valid percent, 40% had no texture. And only 9% had severe texture, which shows that this is much more evenly dispersed across the network, with only 9% having severe texturation, showing that the core sediments in the area are definitely impacting the lithics, but they're not impacting them to severe measures often. It's most it's mostly either traces of texture, which is a very small amount on the surface, or no texture at all, showcasing that it may not be movement based factors, and it may not be sediment-based factors that create this texture. So that created a new interesting problem for these lithics. On Boulder Cliff, this site was the findings from the site supported the previous hypotheses that the Maritime Archaeology Trust have published for Boulder Cliff. The lithics had little to no abrasion across the entire collection. They had little to no gloss or texture. There was moderate marine growth, but very little patination. The hypothesis for Boulder Cliff was that the lithics have eroded from the cliff and fallen right next to it, and that's often where they're collected. Um, People often dispute this, saying that the high currents in the area would cause the lithics to get shifted down the line. Um, but the findings from this supported the original hypothesis. Because there is moderate marine growth requires stability to become abundant. Um, and so it showcases that these lithics likely fell to the cliff had stability for the marine growth to happen, and then were collected. As you can see on the bar graph, Boulder Cliff had by far the highest count of no abrasion and a very low count of both old and both abrasion, with a moderate amount of new abrasion, which again holds the hypothesis firm in the fact that the lithics have fallen out of the cliff, potentially bounced around and been abraded a little bit, um, and then stayed there to accumulate marine growth. And then finally, Rainbow Bar. 92% of the collection evidenced old abrasion and 34% evidenced new abrasion. So clearly there is a large overlap there. Um, and when you look at texture for Rainbow Bar, a lot of them either had old only or both phases of abrasion, but very few had no texture. Um, and very few had only new textural abrasion. This indicates to me that this site had multiple periods of exposure to the surface and abrasion and then reburial. As I said, the site had high currents as well. So the fact that the assemblage was still often found in clusters together showcases that the erosion likely happened in short periods, with reburial happening fast to keep all the lithics fairly close together in proximity. And so when you look at the comparative results, this is where the hypotheses that were previously made about these sites are really showcased. Um, when we look at the marine growth on Boulder compared with the really low marine growth from the Haysboro lithics, this indicates that the metric depends on stability rather than a period of abrasion. Um, because both clearly had a newer period of abrasion, Boulder to be collected from the site and Haysboro to come to shore. But because of Boulder's stability, then the marine growth was able to accumulate on the surface, whereas Haysboro's lithics that were moving to shore likely um, in the high current and storm areas of the North Sea, it likely removed the ability for marine creatures to colonize the lithics. If you look at the clustered 3D bar count of abrasion, comparing Weimar and phase of abrasion, you can see that there is a large cluster of lithics from Boulder Cliff that have a mint or sharp ranking on the Weimar scale, as well as no old or new abrasion, which again supports that hypothesis. You can see as well that there is a cluster, but there are multiple clusters of Haysboro lithics, with both no abrasion and new and both abrasion, um, with very few in the old abrasion category altogether. And so this again indicates that Haysboro may have multiple origins when you're looking at the lithics. And then finally, there's a cluster of lithics from Rainbow Bar that are very rolled, slightly or rolled, um, that have old abrasion, which is very interesting, showcasing this hypothesis about a period of older abrasion and a reburial, and potentially more to create this very rolled surface texture without locational movement. And then when we look at patination, we can hypothesize the sediments surrounding each of the areas, as well as the time they spent next to the sediments. So, Boulder Cliff has a widespread of patination, with relatively similar numbers having yellow rust and no patination, but it is unique for the burnt lithics that are on the site. Um, Showcasing the only site where these lithics were likely used in fire creation, which is really interesting as it points to a cultural factor that can be seen beyond tool creation and the type of tools made within the lithics themselves. Haysboro either had yellow patination or none, with very few having rust. Um, and no gray or mixed patination at all, which is very interesting considering that it seems that iron and associated yellowing minerals were the only ones that are present in the North Sea. Um, Whereas Rainbow Bar had a variety of minerals that were creating yellow, gray, and mixed and rust patinations across the surface of the lithics. These were also the most patinated lithics overall on Rainbow Bar. So, the conclusions, things that I have already kind of told you when I was going through the results. In Haysborough, I think that the groupings within this assemblage in almost all of the categories show multiple exposure types, and potentially multiple sites of origin. A big question with Haysborough is whether the lithics are coming from the cliff, which is on the beach, are coming from close to the shore, or are coming from far out in the ocean. And I think that this shows that there's a potential for all of these to be happening. Um, in Rainbow Bar, as I said, they were heavily patinated, textured, abraded, and there wasn't lots of marine growth. There was moderate marine growth. These likely had periods of exposure, but did not move locationally. Because as I mentioned at the beginning, the fine sediments surround the bar, and yet all of the lithics were very abraded and textured. And there's a cohesion of the collection. And then finally, Boulder Cliff, the lithics likely did not have much abrasion from the original deposition. And all of the data supports the hypothesis that the lithics fell out of the cliff, did not move much locationally, and accumulated marine growth there right before collection. So the overall conclusions, I think that I did around 500 lithics for each of the collection. I think the large swaths of data are more useful for sites overall. You find more when looking at percentages coming from larger data, and things are more likely to be statistically significant when you have larger data sets. And so this encourages people to collect and to care for their lithics, as the data we can gather from them in mass, is meaningful. I also think that comparative data can mean more than individual site data. I think that if I had only looked at one site, I would be less confident in my conclusions and in my ending hypotheses, than I am when I can see tangible differences between sites. Um, I can see that this research shows that the lack of context, even in lithics, does not end the research. That there's more that you can see just by looking at the surface of these lithics, rather than using them as community touching items or giving them away, or just leaving them on the beaches. And then finally, I hope that this system, may be a step towards the identification of the sites, that are out in the ocean that exist that we haven't identified yet. As I said at the beginning, this is not a final step, but it's a step nonetheless. It's working towards the location of these origins and of retracing lithics from where they're found back to where they were placed by the last humans who touched them. So, where do we go next? This is something that I'm very excited about. Obviously, I think that this analysis is useful, and I would hope that other people think that as well and consider using similar analyses, to research lithics and their home collections, or in museums near them. I'd hope that the wider and the larger amounts of data we have, the more conclusions we can find that we're confident in. But as far as what else we can consider to retrace the path of these lithics, we need to look at tides and currents. Today, we can track tides and currents by Googling it. And we can understand how that may impact the erosion of lithics. But we should also consider the tides and currents in the past, from the point of deposition until now, and how that would impact the lithics as well. We can look at what marine creatures colonize these lithics and what conditions they need for housing. I researched encrusting worms a lot, and there are multiple different kinds that can grow a hard, dense, encrusted tunnel on the surface of the lithics from anywhere from 6 hours, up to about a year, depending on the conditions and the type of worm. We can look at bryozoa, limpets, sponges sometimes, and the marine creatures that are impacting these lithics once they're eroded, and what we can learn from that. even as archaeologists. I know sometimes it's hard to look at the living creatures, but it's kind of fun as well. We can look at regional geology and how it's changed over time. I mentioned the sedimentary channels for each of the sites that I talked about, but those sedimentary networks go back hundreds and thousands of years, and we need to understand how they formed and how they have changed from formation up until today to understand how they as well may impact the lithics. Um, we can also look at water composition. The salinity of water does impact the of lithics and how buoyant they need to be to do movement. We can look at glacial periods and inundation of waters as well as regress when they may have been exposed as well, because that impacts erosion. Um, as part of this project, as I mentioned, I was able to dive on Boulder Cliff and see the site with my own eyes and collect a few lithics, um, volunteering with the Maritime Archaeology Trust. And I want to say that I think that was very impactful, that getting a hands-on experience um, meant I understood the site very well. As well, in terms of hands-on experiences, I was able to go to Haysboro working with Dr. Rachel Bino, um, and the Museum of London Archaeology to work on their Deep History Detectives project, where we were able to talk to local collectors, and walk a beach or two and see where the lithics were coming up and understand the intense connection that people of the region have with this history, even so far removed from the present. Um, and I think that as well is something that's really, really hopeful in this research, that there are people today who are just volunteers, who are hobbyists, who are collecting these lithics and who want to know more about them and want to participate in archaeology like this and like the projects I was able to volunteer on.